Hello and welcome to the Chthonia Monday live stream. I'm Breach Burke, obviously, host of Chthonia podcast, and this is my weekly live stream, so if this is a first time tuning in, this is just something that I do as a little bit of an extra to talk a little bit more about the work that I'm doing with Chthonia and different topics related to the podcasts that have come out recently and just other stuff, other materials, writings that I've done. Anything that's basically Chthonia or Dark Feminine connected is something that I talk about here. Now, this week, we just had a podcast come out on the sirens. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a certain aspect of that, and also about some questions that I've gotten over on my other channel. So let me start by giving you some updates on what's going on with me. I have had an incredibly busy week. There's some things I definitely wanted to finish last week and didn't get to. And then there was also just some communication delays and things. Ellen Jones's book, I finally have the image that she wanted me to use for the cover. I might have mentioned last week that when I was trying to put the cover together, the image that she had sent me was so pixelated in the Ingram template that I thought we need to do this over. I don't want this to be, I don't want this to look amateurish. I mean, some of what Ingram does looks a little amateurish anyway, but I want it to at least be the best it's going to be for the color profiles and everything else that we're allowed to use. And certainly I don't want to, I can, pixelated text and stuff should be something I'm able to fix, but it was kind of all put into the one image, so I said, just give me the image you want, and then I'll worry about the fonts and stuff. So, in any case, that's something I'm hoping to finish up today and get in. Ideally, we would have liked to have seen it published by today, because today is the Feast of Mary Magdalene. It would actually be kind of a cool day to have it released. But at this point, I think we're looking at an August 1st release. And I have not had a chance to mention that to Ellen, actually. But she does know that there was... we were actually shooting maybe for the full moon or for something this week. But I'm thinking, yeah, August 1st. I kind of want to just have kind of a date, a milestone date. And once I have that out, then I can start focusing on getting some of my other work. I'm not sure if... I've got two different works that I'm kind of tossing up as to which one I'm going to finish first and put out in terms of my fiction. But I will keep you posted on whatever the next one is going to be. The main thing besides the podcasts, and I have been doing extra podcasts as well for Patreon subscribers do get extra episodes from me, and I did kind of get into, I think this is probably the second podcast I've done for them on horse goddesses, but this was a little bit more focused on Epona, and also on the horse goddess and its connection to sovereignty in particular. We had a little bit of a discussion about that last week. I did something on that. I still do owe my patrons a Patreon-only live stream. But the thing is, the last time I did one, there was a whole bunch of people who were going to come, and then as it turns out, in the end, only one person could make it. So I was like, well, I really want to schedule this at a time that is actually going to legitimately work for people, because I just don't, I want to set it up in a way that's a little bit more organized, and also that's something that's going to be a little bit more special for the people who are paying members. What we get into and what we talk about and so forth. So, in any case, if you're not a supporter on Patreon and you would like to be, you can visit patreon.com/Chthonia. Right now, I'm getting, at least with free members, I'm close to 50 people who subscribe on Patreon. But if I can get, right now, if I can reach 50 paying members, that would be great. And then if I can eventually reach 100 paying members, then I will actually be able to offer annual memberships. So people who don't want to have money coming out every month. And honestly, if you happen to be a creator yourself on Patreon, one of the super annoying things is that when I have, when I want to support somebody else's work, okay, unless they are somebody who has an annual subscription, in which case then I can just pay the year up front, and you get a little bit of a discount for doing that, and then that way I don't have to worry about it coming out of my own Patreon earnings. But if I want to support other people, it just decimates my Patreon earnings. It just takes it out of that, and I'm like, I don't want you to take it out of my earnings. I want you to take it out of the account that I set up that you can take it from. But So that is why I don't end up supporting a lot of people. And I think there's other creators on Patreon who don't end up supporting each other for that reason. Not because they're not, interested in other people's work or don't want to support it, but Patreon makes it difficult. So, so my apologies to people who I have wanted to support, and it hasn't really quite worked out because of that. I think there's only 3 channels that I support. I support April Shaley's work, her astrology work, and I also support Podcast 1289 Productions and everything that they do over there. And I support Wings of Pegasus. Those are the 3 things that I support right now. Wings of Pegasus, he has enough followers that I can actually, Phil has enough followers that I can actually do an annual. So that's one that was the reason I had added him on, because I was like, okay, that's easy. But Patreon doesn't let you do annuals unless you have at least 100 people who are paying. So I usually, this is the time of year where I try to do like a little bit of a Patreon push and try to, not a push so much. I don't want to, if people don't want to, I'm not one of those people who says I want to sell you something that you're not ready to buy or don't want to buy. But at the same time, if there are people who maybe aren't aware that I have a Patreon or something like that, then at least this is the time to let people know what's going on and what the benefits are of membership. And I definitely would like to be doing more on that front. Now, with regard to other projects, people have been consistently asking me about the old episodes. Yeah, that's going to be another beginning of August thing. I will start having the refurbished old episodes cleaned up and put back, and I will actually put them up as I'll probably have a name for the series, where I don't know what exactly I'm going to call it, but it's basically going to be the original Chthonia stuff remastered is going to be done, and I'm going to put it up on, under its own playlist, so that people who say, oh, I really wanted to go back and watch listen to the original episodes, watch, whichever, whether on YouTube or whether you're on Spreaker, then that way you can go back and go through all of those. And like I said, I may not do them in order. I may just start with the major figures that people are interested in, like Lilith, Medusa, Hecate, and I think I've said this already. So that is something that will be coming up. The other thing that I've been working on is I still want to get this school together, and I'm thinking that probably rather than overthinking the first term that I want to do with this, I think what I would like to do is my first semester is going to kind of just start at the beginning place. Let's start with the ideas of femininity and feminine archetypes, because this is something I'm doing called the Interdisciplinary Center for the Study of Feminine Myth. And I think we need to just start with feminine myth. We need to start with, okay, what are mythologies of the feminine in various cultures? What are the archetypes of the feminine? What are the tropes around the feminine? Tropes, stereotypes, things like that. And we can get into different corners as to what we want to talk about, depending on what the lecturers, what their area of expertise is. We can kind of look at it that way. And again, it can be looked at, I think we need to look at it from not only a mythological perspective, but, the feminine in literature, the feminine in poetry, female poets too. There's certain elements of female, there's certainly in contemporary, 20th century poetry anyway, there was a whole string of female poets who were very, very kind of dark in their inflection, and they probably deserve kind of a course or a lecture or a class on their own. And also just looking at the feminine as an archetype in a lot of times in film and in TV shows and things like that, which a lot of people have asked me to do. It's something I kind of have on the list, but because I'm not a person who really has I don't have a Netflix subscription, and I don't, there are certain things that I watch, whatever I can usually see on YouTube, and I have, I think I have Discovery, and I don't know, I might even get rid of it, because Discovery, most of what they have on there is rubbish these days. But there's just certain things, there's things you can get to Prime and stuff like that, and I know there's some other channels, but it's just I'm not somebody who sits down and watches a lot of film and TV shows. It might be that I'm going to bringing somebody else in to talk about that particular topic. But in any case, that's what I'm trying to work towards, hopefully for the fall semester. And hopefully I can have a meeting with people between now and then who I want to involve in the project. and get that going. So sort of to dovetail from that topic into the things I wanted to talk about today. The first thing I wanted to talk about was, okay, so if we're talking about literature and so forth, I've been doing a lot of work on my other channel, Transition Life Coaching, transition.life.coaching. If you don't follow that on Instagram, you can follow it or not follow it, but you can check it out. I've been doing a lot of work over there because that's where if Chthonia is the academic side of what I do in terms of dealing with the feminine, then Transition Life Coaching is a bit more of the practical, or at least the praxis side of what I do in terms of working with people one-on-one on things. So I work with various healing modalities. I do read cards, I read tarot and things, and that used to be actually part of the Chthonia channel. I know back in when we were all in from COVID, I had created like a liminal tarot, that's what I called it, playlist. And in that playlist, I was talking about things like, for example, the last presidential election when it was the Trump-Biden matchup. I had done some readings on that, and some readings on some other things as well that had come up. The Ukraine war when it became a new thing. Different topics I had done on the Liminal Tarot channel, and I think at one point I was actually doing some regular readings. I eventually deleted all that stuff off Chthonia because, first of all, it's old and out of date, but secondly, Chthonia, I realized by probably late 2021 that I needed to refocus Chthonia just on the academics, and I moved all that other stuff over to the other channel. So, any case, with respect to that, I've been getting, interestingly, because my whole method of dealing with transition and the fact that one of the things I do is I deal with Archangel Azrael, Angel of Death, who I do channelings for, which is not something I ever intended to get involved with, but it's just kind of something that happened. So I do it and I post it, and I have a lot of predictions. A lot of predictions were made late spring because, as per usual, people will ask me, starting with my own mother, like, do a reading for me and tell me who's going to win this election. Do a reading for me and tell me what's going to happen here. And I'm like, I don't, I'm interested in that. But what I found was when I was trying to read on that Trump-Biden matchup that I was really getting bizarre readings. Like what I was seeing did not indicate either one of them. And later on, when I was kind of doing the channelings, that was kind of the message too. Like, no, it's not going to be either one of them. And that's the interesting part, because certainly when I started to get that message, I was just kind of like, okay, well, of course it's going to be one. At that point, the primary schedule was set, everything was set. It was like, yeah, of course it's going to be one of those two, right? But then it was very odd because I had gotten late June, I had done, I can't remember if it was a channeling or if it was kind of a Nokian type thing that I was working on, but I got the message of, and the day that I got it, it was like 4 days from now, you're going to see how this begins, is basically what it said, how this begins. Because again, he had said those things, and I was like, okay, well, that's what he said, so, that's what the reading seemed to suggest too, so, maybe, but I didn't have any, you don't have any external evidence, right? And then I think that was on June the 23rd, and that 4 days later actually turned out to be the presidential debate that was such a disaster, and that made everybody start saying, like, okay, maybe Biden's not going to be the nominee, and now, of course, officially, as of yesterday, he's not the nominee. Now, the messages I got about Trump were a little different, because it's not that I did actually see, somebody is going to try to take a shot at him, but it wasn't going to land, basically. But they said, no, it's not going to be an assassination, that he's, I keep seeing things like around heart attack and stroke, like something's going to happen to him beforehand, and either he's going to be too ill to run, or I don't know. I mean, he could be, I don't like to make any kind of predictions of anybody's demise, but, those things might be possible there. So who the heck knows, right? None of us really know. So, and that's just something I don't feel comfortable making any predictions about that. However, whatever it is, it just seems like it would be a health issue that would take him out. And literally the message, the more recent thing I got was not like but right now people are looking at a Trump-Harris matchup. But actually, what I'm kind of getting is it's going to be not that, even though everyone's kind of like, yeah, it's going to be Kamala Harris, it's going to be Kamala Harris, it's going to be Kamala Harris. And that seems to be the way they're going. That was the other thing I got months ago was like, no, it's not going to be a female who runs. There's going to be no females running. And so, I was like, okay. So, but when I sort of looked this morning, I said, well, who's going to be the person? And really the kind of indication I got was going to probably be more like somebody like Gavin Newsom rather than Kamala Harris. But, again, that's not evident at this point. Who says, it's don't know. So, but actually it was kind of more like a Newsom-Vance matchup was actually more what was being implied. But it was going to be two guys. One was from the Senate and one was going to be a governor. That was kind of the thing. So, so interesting. I mean, that was what I had, when people pursued me with that question, that's what I got. But I'm going to talk more about that on the other channel. But it does kind of get into a little bit, with the work I'm doing over there. The other thing that keeps coming up over there is people wanting to know more about my work with the Morrigan, because people know about my work with, Azrael over there. I have the Azrael sessions. People can watch them over on the Liminal Tarot channel, because I do tarot readings, I do that, and then I do a morning live stream every day over there. And so that's another place where people will go and watch me. But I had a lot of questions about the Morrigan and Morrigan as an archetype, because speaking of what I was just saying about feminine literary archetypes, because Morrigan as a figure is, okay, she's obviously an Irish goddess of war and sovereignty, right? And so, but the thing is, okay, so what we know about her, we know from medieval texts. So what we know basically comes from, I want to say writings from maybe like the 8th century onward. Maybe most of them, maybe more around 8th, 9th century up through maybe the 11th, 12th century, and then some later stuff where we have the more traditional Irish texts, the Book of Invasions and the different cattle raid texts and the destruction of the hostels and things like that. All of these kinds of narratives that we have, plus and I'm not remembering the exact name of it in Irish, but the Dinchenkas, I might be saying it wrong. But in any case, that has to do with the origins of place names in Ireland in terms of the folklore. And as I've said, and as I indicate in Morrigan Timelines, a book that has not come out yet. I know I bring it up a lot, but it hasn't come out yet. Because, again, I don't know what's happening over at Theon, but it hasn't come out yet. And one of the things that I had noted in that book when I did research for it was that a lot of what we know about the Morrigan, or actually about anything really in Irish myth, the most reliable sources are really the locals and their stories. Now, the academics will tell you, oh no, they don't know what they're talking about, blah, blah. But the thing is, what frequently it's a question of how does the local story match up with what's found in the landscape. So, for example, if there's a local story about a magical well that's on this property and over here, and they say, oh yeah, sure, But then when they start doing their ground penetrating radar and stuff, they realize there is indeed some kind of a well there. So whether it's magical or not, okay, well, that may be up for debate. But the idea is nonetheless that the story matches up with something that was poo-pooed by other people as like, oh, no, that's not. They're just these local people, they're just making up stuff. And a lot of times they're not making up stuff. I mean, or at least it has a grain of truth in it. It's coming from somewhere. So when we use a goddess like Morrigan, and she for some reason is very, very controversial, as I've said, people don't, especially people in Ireland, are very, very protective of what her image is. They particularly, there's some people who definitely don't like Americans writing about the Morrigan, unless they're doing it in this very scholarly and academic sense. And while on the one hand, I get, the way in which people don't want their own culture, let's just say Disneyfied. You don't want people, in the same way that Ireland becomes like land of leprechauns, and the Irish people like hate that. I mean, and you know what? I don't blame them one bit, not 100%. I understand that you don't want other people repurposing your stories for their own whatever. That said, I've also said, and I say this in the book too, is that, there's a whole Irish American contingent. Okay, so to be annoyed with Americans who are interested in Irish culture, who have Irish ancestry, there were a lot of people who were displaced because of the famine, just displaced because the English just wanted to displace them. So when those people show an interest in the homeland, to get this attitude of like, well, bugger off, you're not really Irish people, is, I don't know. We'll say it's a rather interesting viewpoint. And again, it's not necessarily one held by all Irish people, but there are some factions that definitely feel like they're gatekeepers in that way. So therefore, using Morrigan as a character, I have had the questions before about my own books about Morrigan, where people had said to me, well, why don't you simply say that this character is the Morrigan? And I say, well, because the character is, she follows a kind of a trope or a narrative that, first of all, is based on some kind of trope or narrative that is of interest to me, but also may more broadly be a feminine narrative of some type, where we explore the way in which relationships are understood, or in which we explore the way the whole idea of female sovereignty is understood. And again, a very strong theme that comes through in those novels, and that's all of them. It's Morrigan Timelines, which is the first that covers, and it actually covers two narratives. That's why it's called the Timelines. It's almost like there's two different timelines, two different stories going on that end up dovetailing at the end in a way that, I'm still to this day, I have mixed feelings about how I ended it, but it was how it needed to be ended somewhere. And then, of course, Project Lethe, which came out, which also deals with the trope of, what if you could actually, let's just say if you had the worst past in the world, if you had the opportunity to just forget everything, would you take it? And would you really be able to forget everything? Is that a real thing? Can one literally take an entire section of memory, even with chemical intervention or something like that? Can you actually wipe out a whole section of memory? Interesting question there. And then Regenerator deals more with the themes of the first half of Morrigan Timelines. In fact, it's a character in the first half of Morrigan Timelines who only appears in one chapter, because the first chapter is almost documentary-like the way it's put together. There are different people giving their input on their knowledge of this particular figure, Layla, who is actually like a 21st century, or really 20th century in this book, Macha. And Macha being one of the aspects of the Morrigan that relates to sovereignty, that relates to the land itself. I mean, Macha is literally the word that has to do with the field where cattle graze. It's that's sort of what the meaning of the word is. So, but again, what's conveyed in the story, it's not so much, it's a bit fantastical, in the way, and of course the behavior that she has in certain places often, particularly, you see almost an exaggeration there. And, so I developed those themes in these other books. But the interesting thing for me, that that sort of came up in today's live stream that I did over on the other channel, we talked a little bit about negative emotion, and I said, if you want to kind of turn these psychological concepts on their head, a lot of times in psychology, what we would think is, okay, if somebody comes in, for counseling, or somebody comes in for coaching, which is what I do, if somebody's coming in to have something like that, where they have a pain, an anxiety, a problem that they want to solve, right? Or they want to heal from, or they want to negotiate, look at, whatever it is. There's something that you want to work on. And one of the problems that I often run into as somebody who does this kind of work, both the coaching and on the healing side of things, the energy healing side of things, is that frequently people don't want to be healed. They say they want to be healed, but they don't. And by the way, this is not like a negative judgment on those people. I said you really have to examine the possibility that there's certain emotions, certain very painful emotions, that people get pleasure out of. And so they want to hang on to them. Now, the thing is, because there's that whole layer of, there's that whole social intersection with everything. And the social intersection says, no, you should not, it's wrong of you to think this way. Like, for example, if you've ever had somebody who you see something and you go, God, I hate that person, or you just think like the worst possible thoughts about somebody, whether you wish that person dead, whether you whatever. The thing is, these are thoughts that you might tend to keep to yourself, because when expressed out loud, it's you should not think that way about somebody. You can't have those thoughts. You're not allowed to feel that way. Or if you get really, really angry at somebody for something and people say, well, you just need to calm down. You're overreacting, or just certain things where the person who is experiencing the extreme emotion is kind of shamed out of it, and therefore they repress it. And that's when you have a lot of repressed anger like that, it can turn into a depression. It turns into that feeling that somebody has that they are either powerless, or that they're worthless, or that they're not understood, or that they're not validated. Okay? So, and for me, what I was talking about there is the way in which sometimes these negative invalidations, these wounds that we have, become the stuff of narrative. That can become the stuff of literature, of music, of art, of poetry. It can become the stuff of that. And that is how I use that material. The material that I feel, like I said, the stories themselves are somewhat fantastical, or maybe, and again, we always have this thing of how much realism we want in these particular stories. But to me, it's more about the way in which that wound is expressed. And when people can read literature about it, then that way other people who experience very similar wounding, because we all think we're kind of on our own, but we're really not. Then they can see, well, wait a minute, that's why we get drawn to certain types of literature, because there's something about it that mirrors our experience, even if it's not like, oh, this is a story about me and what happened in my life, not in a literal sense like that, but more in the sense that it mirrors the way in which a feeling that we express. So if you have a person, say, who feels very isolated or lonely, and they read a book about somebody in a completely different situation, but who experiences those same emotions, they may connect with that character and say, oh yeah, I know what that's like, okay? Just as a way of example. So we connect with things because we relate to them, and when we don't relate to them, then and they don't connect with us in any way, then we kind of just say, oh, there's just no connection, there, and so we, and so then we might look at it and say, oh, well, I didn't enjoy that book, or I didn't like this, or I didn't like that. And the other thing though that I find, particularly with the Morrigan books, is that some people like them. Okay, some people just read them and think they're an enjoyable read. But other people are made very uncomfortable by them. And that is something else too. People, there's the old thing of like, my art challenges you, that's good. You hear that kind of a thing. But there's this idea of this as being a challenge. That that sometimes putting that kind of stuff out there that you're not supposed to talk about, the thoughts you're not supposed to have, the things you're not supposed to do, or you have an expression of somebody who actually just keeps it all kind of buried, like as in one of the other variations of the Layla character that I have. It's like, then, what, then the question, and then it can make people uncomfortable because the stuff that they may have buried and don't want to look at, it might bring it to the surface to some degree. Or if people have suffered certain types of trauma, they may say, well, no, this is too, this makes that trauma too fresh. And, as people have said, some wounds don't heal. So that's why people talk about trigger warnings and things now, because people don't want to connect with that, or they want to choose what or how they're going to connect with that kind of material if they want to. So anyway, so interestingly, this all kind of is floating towards the topic I think I mentioned when I posted that the live stream was happening today, and that has to go back to the podcast on the sirens. Now, the sirens are a group of these like bird women, okay? At least in some. In medieval constructions, they're shown more as mermaids. They are definitely connected to the water. They're always around water or near water on whatever island they're said to live on. And there's at least, I think I counted, 14 or 15 different names, depending on the version for them. But usually there's anywhere, I was thinking initially between 2 and 8, I thought I read that somewhere, but really it's between like 2 and 4 sirens that are usually mentioned. Probably most often, though, they're conceived of as being 3 of them. And what they do is they have this really beautiful song that lures, so if sailors who are passing by and hear the song from their island, they turn themselves towards the shore, and then they usually either crash on the rocks, and then they end up shipwrecked on their island, and they end up starving to death because there's, they can lure sailors in with that kind of offer of hospitality, but then they don't actually have any to give. So, so it's interesting that the sirens themselves are said to be the daughters of the Muses, either from Melpomene or Terpsichore, which are, one has to do with tragedy and the other has to do with music. And that's interesting when I say, okay, you've got this kind of juxtaposition of music and tragedy. And the way the sirens tend to be conceived are these kinds of beings that, they have this beautiful, haunting voice, but to follow that voice leads to death. And there are other things that we see in literature and even in religious texts that resemble that idea, the idea of either the beautiful woman or the beautiful voice or something that leads one astray, that leads one towards death. And so I'm not going to reiterate what I mentioned in the podcast. That's something you can listen to, and with the kind of musings that I have on that and the conclusions that I draw there. But what I thought was really interesting was the way in which we have these representations of female beauty. Okay, and the sirens aren't the only example of this. You have, and the sirens supposedly, by the way, get their form from the goddess Demeter, because initially they were said to be the handmaidens of the goddess Persephone. And when Persephone was abducted by Hades, we don't really know where the sirens were. We don't know if they were with her. We don't know if they saw what happened and didn't tell anybody. We don't know if they were wandering off somewhere, leaving her by herself and therefore leaving her vulnerable. Whatever the reasoning is, depending on the version, whether you have Apollodorus' version or Hyginus' version of the story, one says that Demeter gave them bird wings or turned them into birds so that they could fly. They would basically be able to help with the search for Persephone, from an aerial viewpoint, which of course, as we find out, because she was in the underworld, that really isn't too helpful. But they were either turned into birds for the purpose of being able to search for their mistress, or that is considered to be a punishment of Demeter because she said, you didn't look after her. You didn't look after her, and she disappeared. Or at the very least, even if they couldn't have done anything about it, they could have seen what happened, but they didn't. So sometimes it's seen as her punishing them by turning them into these birds. Now, of course, birds are very much associated with song. But what's interesting is that because there's another story about the sirens as Hera urging them into a musical contest with the Muses, who would be, at least one of them is their parent, and they lose the contest, and so therefore the Muses pluck out all of their feathers and wear them as crowns, which is really interesting, because they're supposed to be, like I said, children of the Muses. But there's almost an implication there that something about the songs of the sirens are not true. Like they're not the true inspiration of the Muses, that there's something either off about it or something false about it. So I don't know. So it started me thinking about these kind of monstrous feminine figures. So they, or these beautiful women who have either metamorphosed into these monstrous figures, or that at least historically, the way they might have been described by Hesiod or by Homer or somebody, and then the way they're described in later literature by the time we get to the Roman period, that there's a shift in the perception of that particular being. Okay, so some examples with Scylla and Charybdis. Okay, Scylla originally is supposed to be a beautiful nymph, and there's another being. I forget who the name of the. I want to say it was either a satyr or a centaur that falls in love with her, but she rejects him. So he goes to Circe, to Circe, and says, that he wants her to make a potion so that she will fall in love with him. But Circe is actually in love with this other being and tries to seduce him instead. And when he says, no, I don't want you, I want her, Circe gets jealous, and so she puts this potion into the pool of where Scylla swims and bathes, and then she ends up with these growing like dog heads, and she becomes the horrible monstrosity that is in fact the Scylla that is associated with the Strait. Well, the Strait of Scylla. Some say the Strait of Messina, but I think again in that podcast I talk about the land formations that are supposed to be Scylla and Charybdis, or the I should say I'm trying to think what the right word is. I want to say anomalies, but I don't know if that's exactly the right word. The formations, basically, because Charybdis is supposed to be a whirlpool, and Scylla is this craggy rock that's nearby, so that when sailors come through, they're either going to get snagged by the rocks or going to sucked down into the whirlpool. So that's kind of the thing, being between that rock, a rock and a hard place, right? Scylla and Charybdis, that's literally what that has to do with. But Scylla is originally this beautiful maiden. Medusa, at least in the later conceptions. In the earlier stories, she's just one of the Gorgons, and she's the one that's mortal for whatever reason. But we later versions will say, no, she was a really beautiful woman. Poseidon seduces her in the temple of Athena, or Neptune in the temple of Minerva, Greece, Rome, whatever. And so, Athena/Minerva gets really angry about this and ends up turning her into a being that has snakes for hair. So Medusa starts out as this beautiful woman and then becomes this ugly woman, or this terrifying visage that actually will turn you to stone if you look at her. Okay. Some of the other examples that I was thinking of, I've talked about the Furies or the Erinyes or Semnai, whatever name you have for them. Basically, we'll just stick with the Furies. Again, if you look at old Greek art representations of them, they're portrayed as three very normal-looking, attractive women. Later on, as we get towards the Aeneid and Virgil's account of them, now we are talking about three really horrific-looking, scary women. When we talk about the Oresteia, they're kind of seen that way too, because they're these sort of haggish kind of figures who torment Orestes for murdering his mother, or killing his mother, mainly because his mother had killed his father, and he was supposed to avenge his father's death. But matricide is a crime that the Furies do not have tolerance for, so he was hounded until Athena had a little trial by jury and cast the deciding vote in his favor, and then had to placate the Furies by referring to them as the Eumenides after that, the kindly ones. Yeah. And other thing, just basically trying to suggest that their role is not going to be mocked or diminished because of that decision. So we have, but nonetheless, we have a lot of these conceptions. The Grey Eye are another ones. Grey Eye, the original representations of the Grey Eye is that they actually are portrayed as these very beautiful women. They're older women. They may have had white hair, or but they're not they're not these ugly toothless hags. They're not. There's a beauty to them. So that's very interesting, because then it's like we almost have this conception of these aspects of femininity that are that maybe it may be that the powers or that the things that these feminine figures do can be terrifying, but they're portrayed as beautiful. It's only later on that they're portrayed as ugly, and that ugliness is portrayed as invoking either the terror that they inspire, or later on even an assumption of evil in some cases. Okay, the dangerous aspect of them is equated with something evil. And okay, so the other thing I was thinking about with regard to this, and I talk about it a lot, the way in which shift from being an attractive figure to being a extremely unattractive and scary figure. We also can think about, say, in Hindu mythology, the way in which you will have aspects of femininity that can flip-flop. So Parvati, for instance, can become Kali. Okay, and again, those of us who like Kali tend to think she's kind of beautiful as she is, even though she's supposed to be scary, that she is beautiful. But there's that beautiful benign aspect, and then there is the Chandika aspect. There's the angry, furious aspect. But they're all aspects of the same being. They're not. They may be portrayed in these different ways, but it can be confusing to outsiders who see them all kind of being their worship mishmashed together, or the different stotras and things that are recited to them. Mention all of these different manifestations that are from everything that is just beautiful to the things that are just absolutely gora. They are terrifying, and and the visage is terrifying as well. You've got these dark figures with the tongue hanging out, and the flaming eyes and the skulls hanging around their neck, and basically just devouring everything in their path. Okay, but this is the goddess that is also Parvati or Shakti. This is the same goddess. Okay, so we have this. So that's more of the two sides of the coin. You've got the feminine that is beautiful and nurturing and providing of abundance, with the one that is also devouring and destructive and terrifying. Okay. And then I think the third thing that came into my mind had to do with the stories of the Loathly Lady, which is always a sovereignty figure who appears. And of course, the one in Arthurian legend, Dame Ragnell. She's the one who is probably that's the most common story. And again, I do have a podcast on Dame Ragnell. But she appears to, she comes to Arthur. She's this, this kind of toothless hag who's just very misshapen, and says to him, because he has to answer the question, what is it that women want? I mean, there's a contest that's going to take place in a year, and he has to go meet this giant. If he doesn't have the answer, he's going to get his head cut off. So she says to him, "Oh, I know the answer he's looking for." Find out later that that's the giant is her brother, but but she insists on marrying the most handsome of the knights, and she's this hideous looking hag woman. But the knight says, well, okay, my king tells me I have to marry her, then I'll marry her. And of course he takes her to the bedchamber, and he thinks to himself, well, right, here we go. He's like, I'm just, this is my duty, very duty bound. But then when he kisses her, she turns into this beautiful woman. And she says, yeah, this is my actual appearance. So you have the woman who appears as the Loathly Lady, the very unappealing woman, scarily unappealing, juxtaposed with this woman who is absolutely gorgeous, right? So now we're getting into aesthetics, right? Now we're getting into what's beautiful, what's not beautiful when we talk about the feminine. And of course, generally aspects of the femininity that we care for, that we like, tend to get these portrayals in art, music, other places as something very beautiful, either as a very tender mother figure who is almost portrayed very benignly, or you're talking about a seductive feminine that can be portrayed as this in this way that is obviously very beautiful. Your Waterhouse paintings and things like that. This kind of pre-Raphaelitic kind of vision of the beautiful woman, right? So you have these women who are portrayed in this kind of way. So, but when we talk about these kind of dark feminine figures, okay, Loathly Ladies aside and terrifying monsters aside, we also have those figures that are beautiful, but even the ones that are unappealing. There's like this. If you take the sirens, they have a beautiful song, right? They have a beautiful song that draws men to them. but they are monstrous creatures in and of themselves, right? We have these other figures that are seductive in their own way. It's your succubus kind of figures, who are the women who appear to be very beautiful but are very dangerous. Okay, and this really leads us into a aesthetic concept that was talked about by Edmund Burke. That's known as the Sublime. Okay, so when I think about the sirens, I think about that which is sublime. Now, sublime is an interesting word because it's made up of two Latin words, sub and limen. Limen probably being the word for a boundary or threshold. And sub, it's interesting. Some people see sub as meaning coming up in some of the translations. My understanding of sub is that it has to do with something that's underneath. So in other words, it's under the threshold or it's near the threshold. Okay, but it's not quite there. When we use the word subliminal, we use the term subliminal, and it actually, some people feel like it means the opposite of sublime because it has to do with that which is just under the surface. So if we talk about subliminal messaging, say in advertising or something, it's where you watch something and then somebody's like corporate logo flashes by, but it's so fast that the eyes don't catch it, but some other part of your mind does. That's sort of the idea behind it, is that it's subliminal. And so people say, well, sublime means something totally different because sublime is often translated as lofty. If something is sublime, it's part of the ideal of beauty. And I would argue that actually they mean pretty close to the same thing. Because if something is sublime, okay, what is the difference between the beautiful and the sublime? The beautiful is something, okay, the sublime and the beautiful often are interchangeable. You could do a Venn diagram kind of, where they overlap. But the big difference there is that what is sublime is also terrifying. Okay? It's something that's terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And I think I mentioned this. This is like I said, this was something Edmund Burke actually wrote a whole book on the idea of the sublime. And I have a few notes here just to remind myself. But he had there's sort of the bullet points of what constitutes the sublime. So the first thing he talks about is terror. Okay, and the way that he describes the sublime as being terrifying is in the connected. He said that terror is a passion that's connected to our survival. And it becomes something that can actually be a source of something thrilling when either we have escaped it or when it's something that we can see but it doesn't touch us. This is the kind of, being unable to look away from the auto accident kind of thing, or the train wreck, or the kind of thing that draws us into horror movies and things like that. It scares us, and there's a thrill to that sense of being scared. But a lot of that thrill also comes out of the fact that it's not actually happening to you. You're just kind of viewing it from an armchair distance. This may also be why some people get all involved in the tragedies of other people, because it's not happening to them. If it was happening to you, you'd feel very differently about the situation if it wasn't happening to somebody else. But when somebody's in a terrifying situation, when we can take a distance from it, then there's a certain beauty to it, okay? Or there's a certain, at least a certain pull, a certain desire for it, okay? It's desire for something that is also terrifying. Okay, so one of the other aspects that he talks about with regard to the sublime is obscurity. Whether or not something is, the idea that familiarity kills fear. Okay, so when you know something well enough, it's not, it's no longer, and that's why a lot of times we want the familiar, we want the homely, homely also can mean, have a different inflection, but, something that makes us feel safe and secure. When something is in the realm of what we don't know or that is not clear, then it has the potential to be terrifying and perhaps even dangerous. This gets back to our whole thing of where we like predictability. We like systems that are predictable. We value science over religion because religion deals in what's mysterious. And in fact, Rudolf Otto's idea of the holy comes from this discussion of the sublime. it has to do with the fact that he talks about the Latin phrase he uses is mysterium tremendum et fascinans. It has to do with that which is both fascinating and terrifying at the same time. That's literally the definition of the holy, or the other term that Otto uses, which is the numinous. Okay? It's terrifying, but in that terror there's a beauty at the same time. And so you might think about this as being the mysterious factor. So there could be somebody who maybe you're not sure about, or maybe there seems to be an element of danger to someone, but there's still a fascination. So think about how people will be attracted, say, to the mysterious woman. But that mystery woman might be equated, weirdly modern ways, with like a kind of a siren, like somebody who draws you in, but maybe is going to be, sink or closet, or lead to your, figurative demise in some way if you get involved, right? Or it could be the demise of something else. The term siren is actually often used in reference to a woman who, say, wants to steal a man's, steal a man away from his wife or whatever. Like that person might be, a siren, right? They're kind of viewed as somebody who's doing that, who's breaking up homes, But it's that mystery factor, and that is also just in the whole dynamic of falling in love. That's the difference between the anima and the mother archetype. That's another difference, because the anima has the element of the sublime. There's the element of mystery that you have there. And so if there's somebody that somebody has been dating, even when they become very familiar with that person, once that person becomes wife, and again, this doesn't have to happen, but it can happen that, whatever mysterious thing you were drawn to in that person, now they're just ordinary. So you start looking for that somewhere else, right? That's that mysterious, seductive quality of the anima, which can often be we're talking about the sirens, but it can also be connected with, like I said, with the succubus energy, with Lilith energy, with things like that are that they're obscure, and because they're mysterious, they're interesting, right? Also, the power of something. So something could be sublime that is that also maintains a lot of power, but also only if it's also threatening. So I think the example Burke gave was, if you have a donkey and you have a lion, a donkey, could be a powerful animal, but we generally don't look at them, they're kind of harmless. We don't look at them as being, threatening animals. So you wouldn't call a donkey sublime, but a lion you might call sublime, because it has this awe-inspiring beauty and power and the ability to tear you to pieces at the same time. So there is kind of a beauty there that is terrifying. Privation is another term that he uses, and that has to do with that which is in void. Okay, so he talks about vacuity, darkness, solitude, and silence, all as being things that in certain contexts can be sublime, because they can be terrifying. If you think about the things that people are doing about these liminal spaces, the back rooms and things like that, or just these places that are abandoned, it's the emptiness of them. It's the lack of something, or the something that's there is something that is old and in decay, and maybe it's something where there's supposed to be people, or there used to be people, and now it's just silent. There's something sublime about it. People are drawn to what is sublime about that kind of a thing. And similarly, ideas of like vastness and the infinite also can do that. When we think about the infinity, if you look out at things into deep space, there's something that's very beautiful, but it's also something that can be very terrifying. If you in theory could be in the spaceship and being out there where these satellites are or something like that, that has the potential to be a really terrifying experience. In fact, there are horror movies made about such things. Which again, obviously all speculative, but so the idea of something infinite can also be sublime. Difficulty can be an aspect of the sublime. So the example he gives is something like Stonehenge. We look at it and we say, or even to certain aspects of the Great Pyramids or things like that, where we look at it and we say, how was that built? how did those people know how to build it? How could they possibly have had the technology to build that, right? It's sublime because it's a majestic and beautiful thing, but how it was actually created is a mystery, right? How's it created? And suddenness, okay, he was saying that's another thing. Like, for example, if you see a bolt of lightning, that can be a sublime thing as well. Now, lightning is again, it's both beautiful and has the potential to be terrifying, because if lightning strikes, if it strikes you, that could be a problem. If it strikes near you, you've got to worry, something catching fire or something like that. Lightning is something that is sublime. And interestingly, that may have a lot to do with why god kings are often also wielders of the lightning bolt, because it makes them powerful and terrifying at the same time. So therefore, it can make these god kings. When I say god kings, I don't mean human god kings. I mean like Zeus, Jupiter, Indra, Yahweh. They're terrifying because there's a kind of a sublime element to them. And then finally, the one thing that he talks about is novelty. And that is actually where we have a kind of a line between the sublime and the ridiculous, because it's when you encounter something that is absurd. One of the things I like to tell people, as I said, one of the things I really enjoy is when I look at whether I'm looking at literature or whether I'm looking at mashups that people do on YouTube and stuff. I like it when there's two things that just completely do not go together are put together. So, for instance, there's a channel called There I Ruined It, which is this guy who kind of takes, he will take some kind of a popular song, and he will go and put it to something like from like the 1920s or something. Like he'll do something really weird where you take two completely different styles of music and mash them together in a way that's actually quite hilarious. But again, but I think if we're going to bring the terror factor into it, it could just be one of those things where you're in a space. Okay, for me, I imagine like when I look at the QAnon people who are all standing around waiting for JFK Jr. to come back from the dead, there's something sublime about that, because it's just kind of like, that is just so weird. Like, why are, it literally defies all logic, but somehow it's a thing that we're living and that we're doing. That almost gets into the realm of the uncanny in some ways, where it's almost humorous in the way that it comes across, but there's also kind of this terrifying element to it as well. So absurdity and novelty may also potentially be elements of the sublime. So what does this all have to do with the sirens? What does it have to do with the dark feminine? The thing about the dark feminine, the reason it's something that people, I think the best way to describe it when I think about it in this context is that the dark feminine actually is almost by definition what is sublime. Because it represents an aspect of something that is mysterious. It's sovereign, so in other words, it's not subject to anyone or anything. It's something that's free. And in mythology, we see it represented by these kinds of monstrous feminine figures who are both female and something else at the same time. Like we're not looking at regular animals or regular people or regular, even their conceptions of gods as looking like human beings or whatever. This is something that is, it's a monstrosity. It's a mixture of things. It's a zoomorph of some kind, or it's a mixture of different forms. And so again, it's something. So when we talk about it as being sublime, as a connect to subliminal, it's something that's just beyond the threshold. Okay, it's just under the threshold. It's just beyond the threshold. And most importantly, when it comes to our rationality, it's something we cannot approach with the rational conscious mind. You can't approach it directly. It's subliminal. It's underneath, it's sort of beneath that threshold, because a lot of these figures are also, if we look at what all of these definitions that Edmund Burke comes up with, what they kind of have in common, you're dealing with something that doesn't fall into normal categorizations. It's something that, or it's just something where either there's a lot, like, again, the idea of void, being pregnant with possibility, right? That's the way, if you're a Thelemite, that's the way you describe Nuit, right? All of this possibility, the void of possibility. But in that emptiness, just about anything's possible. So we don't have a form to things. We don't see quite how something is or where it's going. If it's obscure, if it's mysterious, then we can't put our finger on what it is and how to relate to it. We can't say, oh yeah, that's what that is, and this is the thing I have to do, or this is my experience as to how to approach that. We don't necessarily have that. We may only have those senses within ourselves that are often connected to the feminine, our intuitive way of knowing, or our gut feelings, or our instincts. Those may be the things. Our rational mind can't really approach it. And even with isolation, when we're in a space where we are cut off, the mind is no longer your friend in those kind of cases. You can think yourself into all kinds of things, but then also a lot of what, in that empty space, there's a lot that can come out of the unconscious that will come up and that can invade, and that can actually disturb your own equilibrium, because you are because you're in this space where I think about people who say you have to keep busy all the time. They have to have distractions all the time. They have to be doing things because they say if they stop doing things, then that's when all that stuff, there's the void there. That's when all of that stuff that can creep in. It could be past traumas, it could be past memories, it could be worries about things that might happen, it could be whatever it is. It's all of the stuff that gets filled in from that space. And if somebody is more inclined to assume that there is a danger in that, then they're going to be imagining all kinds of dangerous things. So it's interesting, okay, so we think about aspects of the anima as being dangerous, okay, but the idea of the enchantress, okay, who has secret knowledge, okay, she's mysterious in that way, or that seductive siren type or succubus type individual or goddess or whatever that appears to be one thing and may be another, where there's something that's off. It's something that's sort of outside the norm, that doesn't follow the normal rules, or maybe leading you into a path that might be a path of destruction, because it's leading you towards your own, it's leading you towards perhaps your own death and rebirth in some way. Initiations are like that, right? If you go through an initiation, you're in a space where you don't know what's going on. You're in a liminal space. I mean, literally, anthropology has written a ton about that, in the way in which you're kind of in this in-between space. But I feel like this is almost these representations, these feminine representations of that sublime, of what's in between. It is beautiful and lofty in its own way, but it's also terrifying. And those are the things, because if we think about mythologies of order, if you're bringing order out of chaos, when we don't know what's going to happen, when we can't see a structure, when we can't figure out where something is at, or everything that our rational mind teaches us actually takes us in a different, the rational mind doesn't take us into the right place for that. Or our logical conclusions fall short because they don't, because we're dealing with something that can't necessarily be approached with the mind. Then we become fearful of that. Then it becomes, if we treat it as a danger, and sure, there's always a dangerous element, but if we're always treating it as a danger, then it's not something that that may be the way that we elect to negotiate it, is to simply avoid it entirely. Or to say it has to be something that is kept under, that's repressed, that's not brought out into the light of day. And this goes back to the conversation I was having a little earlier about what I talked about on this morning's live stream, which is what is the place of negativity and negative emotions, or people who get into spaces where they enjoy sorrow, or they don't want to get out of a space of sorrow or rage or something like that. They're in this kind of space where the it is sublime in a way. It's beneath the surface. It's in this place where we are, where the normal categories of things don't apply, the normal social rules don't apply. And to be in that space, to be in that free space where you're not bound by these other conventions, and where you're not this is not the same kind of being that people can simply identify and say, oh, this is who you are, and this is what this is about, or this is what you're about. This is why trans people are so frightening to people, because they're like, well, wait a minute, you have to be something that I can easily define, right? When people fall outside of that, it's almost like now they're outside the social structure. Now they're in the realm of the taboo. And that's what these things represent. But we have to remember that they represent parts of our experience that cannot be approached with rationality. And just because you can't approach something rationally doesn't mean it's an evil and a danger and something to avoid. It's something you have to negotiate differently. Your rational analysis may not help you, but it's part of human experience nonetheless. And like I said, religion has ways of approaching it. Initiatory systems have, whether they be esoteric, usually esoteric initiatory systems will have their ways of approaching it. We may have our ways of approaching it. Jung kind of felt that psychology could be a means of approaching it, okay? But, the psychology that people practice today is just very, very materially based, or very medically based. So it tries to say, oh, we don't deal with all that stuff because, we don't, because it's not on solid ground. There's not a lot of solid evidence. There's not solid things that you can point to and say, oh, yes, this is exactly what this is, and it comes from this, and it's caused by that. In the same way you can diagnose if somebody has, I don't know, diabetes or something like that. These things don't fall into those categorizations. So they become something that is considered to be a danger, and something that is either swept under the rug and dismissed as something that isn't, that we just avoid it because it's not proper. It's not socially proper to address it. Or it's something that we, when we do address it, we have to address it in the modicum of trying to do something to diminish or control it. And, that's not really the point. Things that are sublime, remember, they're part of the aesthetics of beauty. It's something beautiful that draws, beautiful yet terrifying that draws us in. And we have to remember that that's a very similar definition to what we think of as the holy. Okay, and we believe that only certain key people can make that approach. But I think everybody at some point in their journey makes that approach. In some phase of their life, that they make that approach. So interesting. Just some different thoughts on the Sublime and how that connects to the Sirens. And also, again, was talking a little bit before that about literary archetypes, about the Morrigan and things like that. Normally I like to say hello to everybody as they come in, but I figured I was on a train of thought, and sometimes I get myself easily distracted. So just a quick hello and thank you for joining me to all the people who are here and who joined me this morning, or, well, it's afternoon at this point here. And hope you enjoyed this. We're a little after 1 right now, so I'm probably going to bring this to a close. But as always, I always thank you guys for joining me. I'm glad to have people who are here and able to listen on a Monday. And of course, like I said, the new podcast is up on the Sirens. I've just put that up today. If you subscribe to the podcast, it'll be on your podcast app soon, if it's not already. And of course, it is also up on YouTube. And I will have this video posted. It'll be here on Instagram, and then I'm also going to post it to YouTube probably by tomorrow. So I hope you all have a great rest of your Monday and a great week. And I will see you next time. Take care.